trying to teach from a state of isolation. If it's not good, just use your imagination. Remember, rapping's not my occupation. Mr. Captain giving you an education. Yeah? Right? Right? I think so. Hey everybody, Mr. Captain here. As you can guess, we're going to talk more about ideologies. We've just finished talking about fascism and communism, and Hitler and Stalin and how they rose to power in their respective countries. Today we're going to move on to World War II, why that started, how it ended, and specifically what happened afterwards, how it led to a long, drawn-out stalemate between two world superpowers and a conflict known as the Cold War. Let's talk about challenges to liberalism related to foreign policy. As you can see on your screen, there's a bunch of terms and key concepts that are related to this, some of which are probably familiar. I'm hoping World War II is something you've heard of and maybe studied in the past, but there might be some terms on here you're less familiar with. For example, McCarthyism. But don't worry, we're going to get to those in the next few lessons, and more. We're also going to look at these two questions over the next few lessons. To what extent did ideological conflict affect international relations after the Second World War? And in what ways did this conflict of ideologies affect societies and people's everyday lives? There's been a bit of a pattern, if you've noticed, in our course so far, where we look at ideologies, how they play themselves out, and how they impact the quality of life and people who lived at that time. Let's review by looking at this economic spectrum. On the far left, we've got greater government involvement, and on the far right, a greater reliance on free market forces and less government involvement. In the middle, we've got modern liberalism and mixed economies and a bunch of countries that generally like liberalism. If you were to go far right or far left, you would reject all ideas of liberalism. We just recently talked about the radical communists of the Soviet Union and the reactionary fascists of Germany, being on the extreme ends of the spectrum and completely rejecting the ideas of liberalism. We're going to continue on, especially talking about, we're going to talk about both those things actually, but we're going to focus on how countries decide to work together or against each other while operating from different locations on this spectrum. In 1927, Joseph Stalin made a prediction about what would happen in the future, and in retrospect, it was eerily accurate. He said, "There will emerge two centers of world significance. A socialist center, drawing to itself the countries that incline towards socialism, and a capitalist center, drawing to itself the countries that incline towards capitalism. Battle between these two centers for command of the world economy will decide the fate of capitalism and of communism in the entire world." So Joseph Stalin made this prediction or said this in 1927, which was before World War II. We're going to talk about World War II next and what happened afterwards, but keep his prediction in mind as we move forward. World War II. You may have heard of it. I'm actually assuming you've heard of it and you know a bit about it, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in this video talking about it. There's lots of resources out there because it's such a key event in our history. It's easy to find resources that can help you out. There's lots of summaries on YouTube. Check other places online if you need more information than I'm giving you here. But for our purposes, let's keep it simple. Let's just look at this timeline. It may refresh your memory of things you've already heard. So the war began in 1939 with Germany invading Poland. They were motivated by their fascist ideology and their leader, Hitler. Italy and Japan were on the same side as Germany. They believed a lot of the same things. They believed in the fascist ideology, whereas the rest of the world did not. They didn't like what was happening. They decided to put an end to it. So the Allies, which was led by Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, they fought the Axis powers. And you can see following these battles and invasions, Italy surrenders in 1943, then Germany in 1945, followed by Japan also in 1945 after the atom bombs were dropped on them by the United States. So we're not going to go too much into these events, But we should know that this war is connected to ideology. And countries that even disagree ideologically joined forces in order to fight a common enemy. So we talked about the Allies in World War II. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, led by Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. They came together throughout the war a number of times to strategize and to talk about how to overcome a common enemy in Hitler, in Germany, in fascism. Near the end of the war, they met in Yalta, in what's known as the Yalta Conference, when they talked about how they were going to rebuild or redraw the lines in Europe. After Yalta, the big three were faced with some tough questions, like how to treat Germany. Should they be punished severely or supported in their rebuild? Should the United States provide economic aid, and with how many strings attached? Is Stalinization a problem, or is it an effective strategy for rebuilding Europe? What about the Hungarian Revolution and other revolutions that were happening around the world? How should they be handled? With no more common enemies, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States had to find a way to work together. But it was difficult because they did not share an ideological starting point. A year after Yalta, Winston Churchill made a speech that contained a metaphor that compared the ideological divisions of the world to an iron curtain. It's pretty famous. You may have heard of the Iron Curtain before. Let's listen to a little bit of his speech here.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow.
After this speech, many people thought he was being an alarmist, meaning that he was causing unnecessary fear and panic, while others thought he was a messenger or a prophet of what was to come. Churchill's metaphor and Stalin's prediction from years before ultimately came true, when after World War II, two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. They drew an ideological line in the sand. On one side, capitalism, on the other side, communism. The years that followed were extremely tense, and this time period became known as the Cold War, which is what we're going to talk about next.
Mr. Captain giving you an education.